Hey everyone, it's Skiesti. Many of you already guessed that creators participated in the Overwatch 2 alpha, and that included me, which I am extremely grateful to have had that opportunity, and now I can share it with all of you. Today, I'll be talking about how Mercy changed during the alpha, how it felt to play her in 5v5, and a few additional nitpicks that I have. As a reminder, since this was the alpha, it was being updated weekly, so things were changing throughout its run. What is shown here is probably going to be a bit different from the upcoming beta, and in my game specifically that I'm going to show you, some of them were from the first version of the alpha. Before we jump into it, I would just like to appreciate the new look of Mercy's healing and damage boost beams. Although they look a bit more similar to one another compared to Overwatch 1, I'm really glad that they were made to be thicker in Overwatch 2. The best way that I can describe it is that it just feels like it stands out more, which to me felt great, because when there's so much else that requires your attention, and especially when teamfights get hectic, it's much easier to keep track of your beam targets this way. Oh, and one more thing that I just have to address before we keep going. Mercy's super jump is still in Overwatch 2. Don't worry, it didn't go anywhere. Anyway, moving on, let's start with a quick overview of Mercy and how she progressed in the alpha. Firstly, she didn't get reworked. We'll just get that out in the open now. But honestly, she was barely touched at all, which I can understand since she's objectively in the most balanced state she's ever been in. However, with all the new changes other heroes are receiving, she feels pretty lackluster in comparison. It'd be nice to see Mercy have some kind of small burst healing like people have been wanting, just to be able to keep up with the other supports. But even something like that might be too much, as players already struggle and grow frustrated trying to kill heroes that are being pocketed by Mercy. As well, she still doesn't have a lot of agency herself. The 5v5 format is supposed to mean that there's more individual contribution able to be made by players. However, for Mercy that isn't really the case. She still lacks the ability to have the same consistent impact that other heroes have. And that's not to say that she can't make plays. She just doesn't really make them in the same way. In the first version of the alpha, Mercy didn't really have any changes from Overwatch 1. Her healing was reduced from the 55 HP per second it is in Overwatch 1 back to 50 HPS, and her passive regeneration was reduced from 20 HP per second to 10 HPS, because it stacks with the new support role passive. And if you don't know what the new support role passive is, well, supports regenerate 10 HP per second after 2 seconds if they don't take any damage. Sound kind of familiar? When we first heard of this support role passive, I wasn't crazy on it, because you're sort of taking Mercy's unique passive and giving it to all the other supports, and Mercy essentially gets nothing new or particularly interesting. And it just feels like she sort of got cheated. When you first saw the way her passive stacks with the support passive, Animatic posted a comparison of how it's actually a nerf to Mercy's regeneration, because her unique regen starts after 1 second of not taking damage, and the support role passive starts after 2 seconds. As the alpha progressed, Mercy received a few changes. Her healing was bumped back up from 50 HP per second to 55 HPS, and luckily, the way her unique regeneration passive works was adjusted. Her passive now increases the effects of the support role passive rather than being its own passive that's stacked with the role passive. She now regenerates 20 HP per second instead of 10 HPS, and her regen kicks in after not taking damage for 1 second instead of 1 and then 2 seconds. This change in the way her passive works makes it less messy and restores Mercy's passive back to the way it is in Overwatch 1, where she gains 20 HP per second after 1 second of not taking damage. And all of this is just a long-winded way to say that Mercy's kit is exactly the same in Overwatch 2 as it is in Overwatch 1. With that said, I'm really glad the rumors of the whole angelic blessing ability thing that were going around a couple months ago weren't true. Also, by the way, if you've never heard of the angelic blessing ability rumor, that's okay. I'll explain it really quickly. Essentially, Res would be removed and replaced with Angelic Blessing, which would have a 20-second cooldown and send a soul to a teammate that they can use to give themselves a guardian angel to a teammate of their choice. And if not used, it goes away after 6 seconds. When this rumor initially came about, I was really against it because while there are interesting uses for it, it would be incredibly tough in ranked because teammates just aren't likely to listen to Mercy players or work with them to get the most value out of the ability. It would have made Mercy even more dependent on her team than she is now, which I just don't think is a good idea. As I mentioned before, her 50 HP per second was reverted back to 55 HPS, but I wanted to touch on why 50 HPS just isn't enough for Mercy. In the earliest iteration of the alpha I played that still had her 50 HPS, you frequently felt helpless when you were in situations where you had to focus primarily on healing. With one less tank to help the team reduce damage taken, it leaves a singular tank that has a larger health pool and without a way to boost HP per second. As Mercy, you were frequently unable to prevent deaths and had to hope that teammates would use hard cover to mitigate the damage they took, and more often than not, they didn't do that. Healing often felt useless since you were simply just incapable of keeping them alive with her reduced healing output. Although Mercy still doesn't feel particularly good with 55 HP per second when she's forced into being a main healer, aka your second support picks Colosseo, Zen, or Brig, and you're having to heal your tank more often, it's at least better than trying to do it with 50 HPS that was in the early alpha, but it's still not great. When it comes to main healing with 55 HP per second, it feels like it takes forever to heal a tank to full, especially if that tank doesn't have a shield or ability to better mitigate incoming damage. Although she had a few changes throughout the run of the alpha as we covered earlier, she remained the same as she was in Overwatch 1 because all the changes in the alpha, which were nerfs, were then reverted. In a game where we see many changes, the support role just doesn't feel that same love, especially when it comes to Mercy. In Overwatch 2, Mercy is much more vulnerable now, which can lead to a potential loss of survivability depending on the way you're used to playing her. Due to the loss of a tank and without the guarantee of a shield, it's even more important that you prioritize playing hard cover. Playing cover to cover was already one of Mercy's best friends in Overwatch 1, and because you're more exposed and vulnerable to enemies now, it's equally, if not more so important in Overwatch 2 to do this. If you tend to rely on shields a lot or peel from your team, you're gonna have to start learning how to protect yourself a bit better. One small thing to add here is that there will be additional cover added to existing Overwatch maps to accommodate having one less tank. With an even bigger emphasis on using cover as Mercy in Overwatch 2, this will be a great advantage for us. In general though, when it comes to surviving, I normally try to not rely on my team too much for peeling or healing, and in Overwatch 2, it felt like I was even more on my own, which I didn't mind. But in some situations, a lack of support, either from having one less tank or from the game feeling a bit more hectic, made me feel somewhat helpless. You really do have to be more mindful of your positioning in Overwatch 2, and again, playing cover to cover becomes even more necessary if that's not something you do already. Moving on, because you only have 5 players on your team in total, including you, less healing is required in Overwatch 2 across the board. With that in mind, Mercy isn't a bad pick, she's kind of okay. Even before I played the alpha, I figured Mercy would be better because there's one less tank to worry about. Even though, as Mercy, you shouldn't be too concerned about tanks, we all know there were times where we had to be. Taking a tank off the field, however, should relieve this pressure some Mercy players feel to have to heal tanks. Keep in mind that Mercy has never been good at keeping tanks alive because she hasn't been a main healer in a long time. Healing isn't her priority and isn't the reason to play her. The thought process is that the less healing a team needs and the more you can enable your teammates by boosting their damage output, the more useful Mercy is. On the other hand, if she's forced into the position of being a main healer because her second support happens to lock Colosseo, Zen, or Brig, you're still going to have a hard time having to primarily heal. This is because although there's only one tank now, that tank has an increased health pool and there's less barriers to mitigate incoming damage. You just have to hope that your team will play more around environmental cover. And if they don't, then I guess you're gonna be spending forever trying to heal them. In addition to that, Mercy still doesn't have any type of burst healing, so healing a tank to full will take ages to do. I wanted to touch on damage boost really briefly. Damage boost felt like it still has great value because you can focus more on enabling DPS without worrying so much about if your second healer can keep the tank alive. There's also less shields or ability for the enemy to sustain. The closest idea I can compare it to was when 4 DPS, 1 tank, and 1 support was meta, and that support was typically Mercy since she thrives with DPS comps. This is a little like that, but not quite. However, I did notice that I was ending games with less damage amplified than I did in Overwatch 1. Although, later when I compiled the stats I was ending each game with, it's more likely that because it was quick play, the matches were shorter, resulting in overall lower statistics. I didn't take this into account until after this video was almost done, and I thought about taking this section out entirely, but I still think that this is worth mentioning somewhere. If you find your damage boost is lower, it could be because of a few factors such as 1. You've got 1 less tank for DPS to shoot, and although tank health pools were increased by a bit, I feel like this is still worth mentioning. 2. You've got 1 less target to damage boost because tanks can be good damage boost targets in some situations. And 3. Having less shields to break contributes to a lack of damage amp as well. I'm sure there were more contributions, but these were the ones that I really noticed. Since I brought up that stat, if you're interested at all in knowing what my stats were throughout the alpha, here's a quick look at what I was ending some of the games with. Despite all that, I still believe it's more than possible to have a damage amp over 2k per 10. 2k per 10 is what I normally recommended when people were asking me about what their damage amp stats should look like, and although stats don't tell the whole story, that's kind of the ballpark that I gave them to aim for. Now, I'm not really sure where to bring this next, observation up. I have some nitpicks I'm gonna go into later, but this doesn't really fit in there. It's more just, you should know this. Due to the new damage roll passive, which is a 10% faster movement speed, DPS will now go out of range in about 3 seconds at max beam range. This is just something to keep in mind if you tend to play max beam range of your pocket targets, like you probably should be doing already, if you're not. Okay, let's talk about how the ping system felt to use as Mercy. Admittedly, I was struggling when I first played the alpha to learn how the ping system works, only to find out if I wanted to do simple pings, I just had to press my understood keybind in the direction of other players. Yeah, I know. And now that I've gotten that on the table, I can say that being able to ping as Mercy once I figured it out is such a blessing. I've always maintained the opinion that Mercy is one of the best shot callers in the game because you can look in any direction while beaming your allies to notice or observe things, and the ping system makes relaying information to your team feel so much better. When I was looking around for enemies, I thoroughly enjoyed being able to ping their exact location when they came into view, or mark potential flanks to watch out for with just the press of a button. I could also ping enemies that I wanted my teammates to focus first in fights, which, while it didn't work all the time, it's pretty hard to ignore a persistent ping. The only thing that would be a great addition to the ping system, specifically for Mercy, is the ability to ping an ally's soul to indicate to your team that you plan on rezzing. I feel like, especially for Mercy players that don't use their mic or have a hard time remembering to tell their teammates when they're rezzing, and I'm certainly guilty of the second one, but being able to ping res would end up being incredibly useful for both the Mercy and her team. So just for fun, I want to go into a few nitpicky things about Mercy from the alpha. First off, the visual indicator for Guardian Angel was changed, so instead of the keybind text being a color and the background being black, it swapped so that the keybind text is black and the background is filled in with a color. This change made the visual GA indicator more noticeable, which, in turn, felt much more distracting when this is the sort of thing that should be present yet invisible, if that makes sense. Like, it should be there, but it shouldn't be drawing the player's attention to it. The biggest nitpick I have is about Mercy's UI. Overall, it is much harder to read and quickly comprehend Mercy's UI in the alpha compared to Overwatch 1. While I do greatly prefer the look of her new UI layout, there are a few decisions that were made that either make the UI difficult to read or it leaves out key information. Firstly, the smaller health bar is probably the biggest problem when it comes to her new UI. When I'm playing Mercy, I'm normally focused on quite a few things at once, so I tend to just glance at the health bar briefly. With the smaller health bar here, I'm having to actually look closer and spend more time to see if someone needs to be healed because it's just so much smaller, making it more difficult to see, which just didn't feel great. Her UI is also missing when allies have effects such as anti-nade or immortality field, which is a pretty significant loss of information. And the last one is much more minor, but her UI doesn't state the name of the player you're beaming anymore. All of these things are unfortunate losses for her UI that I hope are adjusted either before or during the run of the upcoming beta. That's all from me for now. I'd love to know your thoughts about Mercy and the alpha in the comments, especially since we'll be going into the beta very shortly. I have a few more videos of me going through games I played from the alpha that'll be out soon. If you have any specific content of Mercy you want to see from me in the beta, let me know. I would absolutely love to hear them because I am so stoked to make more content for Mercy from Overwatch 2. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you next time. Thank you.